Okay, welcome to this Insider series today on insurance to enable NBS for wildfire risk reduction, which is being sponsored by the NATURANCE project. I'm Joanne Linneruth Beyer, and I will be moderating this really, I think, very interesting session for the next hour and a half. And interesting session, and also, I think, really very, very topical. I mean, I probably don't need to tell this audience, and I understand our audience is very, very mixed, but also very professional. So I know that you all are very aware of the fact that wildfires across the globe and also in Europe are increasing in both frequency and intensity. We all know that that's related very much to climate change, but also, of course, our activities on the land use, land vegetation, and also, of course, our human interactions with vegetation. I think there's really two very unique things we're going to talk about, maybe three, this session. And one is, of course, how we're looking at these increasing risks, how we model them. But then we're also going to be moving to some of the issues in their management. And one piece of background, which has always kind of been inspired me, is that we're becoming very aware that we're going to have to move from suppression more to prevention. And many reasons for that, but one is that suppression is getting increasingly difficult because the extreme nature of the fires, very hard to actually suppress them, put them out. The second thing is that we're also realizing that, our speakers are going to be speaking very much to this, the fact that we need to deal with preventing them through nature and all the co-benefits that nature-based solutions supply. It might surprise you, it did me, that the European Union is putting 90% of its funding into suppression, meaning the infrastructure, helicopters, and so on that you need. And of course, that's important. But only 10% at this point is going into prevention. And I think one purpose of all the work that we're doing is to change that, not to reduce how much goes into suppression, but increase how much goes into prevention. And that mindset is changing. It's very definitely an awareness of that at the moment. One other sort of the unique thing is kind of understanding that what happens with nature-based solution, wildfires, and across the board with hazards depends a whole lot on our financial system. And how, the roles that all financial actors play, but particularly insurance companies. So today we're also going to be looking at how that interaction. So let me just turn now to our speakers and questions we're asking. So first, we're asking actually how are wildfire risks changing? What are the latest developments in wildfire insurance models? And for that, we have a very experienced speaker, Dr. Daniel Bannister, who is at WTW, Willis, who leads the weather and climate risk research there. And he definitely brings together all of the kind of academic work that's been done on the science, and also connects that with the insurance analytics. And his work covers wildfire modeling, climate hazards, and extreme event analysis across the globe. So we're going to be very much looking forward to his talk. Secondly, we have the question, what are nature-based solutions for wildfire risk reduction? And it seems like a simple question, but it's not. Very complex, and really a person very much qualified to deal with that complexity is Saskia Kistra, who's leading work in climate kick and also at the Wageningen University in research. And she's going to benefit a lot from her contribution to the latest European Environment Agency's report on nature-based solutions for fire-resilient European forests. And she works broadly on climate adaptation, soil management, forestry, and sustainable land use. And then we're going to turn to the third presentation here, and that's how can insurers here we bring in very definitely insurers, as we did also in the first presentation, but how can insurers enable nature-based solutions for wildfire risk reduction? And for that, we have my colleague here at IIASA, Timothy Foreman, Tim, and he's also assistant professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And his work with me actually has been focusing on how finance, and particularly insurance, can support climate and nature goals. And as part of the NATURANCE project, he has co-developed a taxonomy of insurance activities that enable nature-based solutions with a focus on scaling innovative models. So I think it's really a very stellar group of speakers, and so I won't say any more, but turn right over to Dan. And so Dan, I will stop sharing now, if I can manage this.
Thank you. I will put up my slides.
Okay, stop sharing. We go. Perfect. I see it. Yeah.
Brilliant. So thank you for that introduction, Joanne. So as Joanne introduced, I'm Dan Bannister, and I lead the weather and climate research and partnerships and collaborations that we do at Willis with our academic and research partners. And I've been asked to cover quite a lot in about 12, 15 minutes, but I really want to just give an overview of kind of what's changing in wildfire risk globally, and then draw from that what insurers need from wildfire models as a result. So I'm going to cover quite a few things at a relatively quick pace, but the core message I really want to land on at the end is that what we're seeing is that wildfire losses aren't just rising because fire activity is changing, but rather it's the extreme fires which are increasingly intersecting with exposure with the human environment. And that's exactly where our traditional models are most fragile. So at this point, I just want to flag and kind of raise awareness of the State of Wildfire report. Some of you might already be familiar with it, or you might be connected to the initiative. But for those that aren't, the State of Wildfire report is essentially an annual and global assessment of produced by the research community of the most recent fire season. It really brings together global expertise, observations, data, as well as regional expertise to really dig into the most recent fire season and how that compares to the historical baseline. So I really encourage people to go away and kind of look into that if you're not familiar with it. And the State of Wildfire report gives this really nice graphic actually of the 2025 season. And on there, you can see some of the big headlines on there. Some records certainly were broken, but the 2025 season wasn't necessarily a season where all records were broken. And global burned area is a really good example of that. It wasn't necessarily unprecedented. What really stood out last year from the 2025 season was really actually how uneven the impacts were and how strongly clustered they are around three distinct patterns. The first is that we saw extreme fires in regions that burn every year. The second is we saw extreme fires burning in regions with little wildfire experience. And then the third kind of storyline or example is that, and most importantly for the insurance industry, is we saw extreme fires intersecting with our dense urban environments. And it's those three examples I just want to draw out in a bit more detail. Obviously, first, regions that burn regularly. South America is a really good example of that. Fires aren't new there. What the most recent season really saw, though, was exceptionally high emissions, about 3 times higher than usual. Now, of course, for the insurance industry, CO2 emissions aren't necessarily a concern, but what this really is an example of is that it's not always about fires appearing somewhere new that's a concern. It's about the upper tail or the extremes or the severity shifting already in familiar regions. And from a risk or an insurance perspective, that's important because we care disproportionately about those extremes. And if the tail is changing, then any model that's kind of calibrated on the central tendency or the average is obviously going to struggle to represent the losses that matter most. So that's one example of how risk is changing, not appearing somewhere new, just becoming more extreme where it already exists. The second theme that we're kind of seeing is that we're seeing fire activity in places that haven't traditionally burnt at all. The UK and Northwestern Europe is a really good example of this. Now, obviously, these regions aren't going to become classic wildfire regions like California, like Australia, but why fire appearing in places like the UK matters for the insurance industry is because when it appears in a new geography, we tend to lack a couple of things. We lack loss history to calibrate vulnerability. We lack any institutional memory on how to underwrite it, and we also lack models to really understand the risk. And this all feeds into kind of model fragility, because fragility in models is highest when evidence is weakest. The third example I just want to go through is then the one that connects most with the insurance industry. In 2025, we obviously saw Los Angeles experienced the largest wildfire insurance bill in history. And again, LA, California, they're not necessarily new to wildfires. The point is that what drives catastrophic losses isn't that fire exists in these places, but the fact that it aligns with exposure with where people live. And what 2025 showed is that the fire footprint doesn't necessarily have to be enormous for the losses to be enormous. What matters is what sits in that fire footprint and how that fire behaves once it enters the urban environment. So just to maybe summarize all those three things, what we're seeing is extreme fires in familiar regions, extreme fires in unfamiliar regions, and then extreme fires in places that are intersecting with our urban environment. And that's kind of simplified or summarized in this slide here. What we're seeing from the insurance side is that losses are increasingly driven by the tail of the distribution, so the extremes, by where fires occur. So we know that wildfire risk is global, but insured losses aren't. And they're also controlled by the interaction with human systems. And all of these three things also compound together really as to why wildfire losses are increasing. And again, there's three more reasons here. What we're seeing is that exposure change means we're building more buildings that are more expensive in the wildland urban interface. And that's really determining what can be lost. The second reason is climate change. And that's obviously driving more extreme fire behavior, which is ultimately determining whether that exposure is damaged. And then the third is actually cost amplification, which determines how expensive it is to rebuild. And rebuilding in today's economy is materially a lot higher than it used to be. So the kind of question that follows on from that is that, do we see this in insured loss data? Can we actually see a change in wildfire risk and losses? And the answer is yes. So this slide here just kind of shows this insurance manifestation of the increasing risk related to wildfires. In the inset, that bar plot in the top left-hand side, that shows the decadal global insured losses from wildfires, and you can see how that's materially increased in the most recent decade compared to the past. The time series at the bottom actually shows that what's more important is the shape of it. That increase over time has not been smooth. It's not been gradual. It's actually punctuated by major events and seasons. And I think that's why why wildfire is such an important topic for the insurance industry. It's a peril that can surprise us. And this slide just makes that point more directly, I suppose. Wildfire now appears as the biggest or one of the biggest global catastrophe event losses. It's certainly in the same conversation as the perils that have traditionally dominated global catastrophe thinking. So traditionally things like hurricanes, and you can see these are the global insured losses from a number of hurricane, severe convective storm, wildfire, and earthquake events. The chart is largely dominated by hurricane losses in the past. But if we were to plot the Los Angeles fires, which have an estimated insured loss of about $40 billion, they would be of a box kind of a similar size to Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Harvey. And this kind of moves then on into why model adequacy matters so much for the insurance industry. If wildfire losses are increasing because they're increasingly intersecting with exposure, then our current models really need to represent that intersection and how and why wildfire risk is changing. The bad news is that that's not necessarily always the case. The models that we traditionally use in the insurance industry are very much calibrated on the past. But what we know is that wildfire risk is changing, and they're not necessarily capturing those modern day losses. Other limitations are things like these models tend to prioritize landscape fire behavior. They don't really capture urban escalation or ember-driven spread, which is why the Los Angeles fires were so severe. And they also lack in the kind of the human component, so ignition, suppression, and mitigation, and nature-based solutions, as we'll come on to later. It's really difficult to capture or represent those things probabilistically or dynamically. So what we find is that the models are often most fragile precisely where we're getting modern day losses. And that doesn't mean that the models that we use are completely useless. It just means that we have to understand their design boundaries a bit better. The good news is that what we're seeing is that modeling wildfire is evolving, and it's evolving in ways that can address some of the challenges that I've previously discussed. So over the last couple of years, we've actually seen new releases from the main catastrophe model vendors that have moved beyond a purely historical view of wildfire risk. So, for example, rather than assuming stationary fire conditions, we're beginning to see models that actually incorporate climate change more explicitly. And that has largely been through the variables that control fire weather, so things like temperature, wind, and humidity. A second area of improvement that we're really seeing is a better reflection of how the fuels evolve over time, how development expands into fire-prone areas, and how those fires escalate once they hit that exposure. So we're seeing things like dynamic urban conflagrations and, like I said, ember spread as well, which are so critical for loss. Importantly, and I think it's worth noting, I think several of these newer models have now been approved by the regulatory authorities and bodies in California, which means that they can be used for practical applications, so things like insurance pricing. And all of this represents a really good positive direction of travel, but it also raises the bar for insurers, reinsurers, brokers, and so on. I think as models become more complex, more dynamic, and more diverse, the insurance industry also needs to become more dynamic and more diverse in how we interpret those results and understand some of the assumptions that kind of gone into them. And I think the good news is that actually that's where collaboration is essential, why it's really good to be with this audience today. I think if wildfire losses are rising because they're increasingly intersecting with exposure, then the most important type of collaboration is going to be collaboration that really just improves our understanding of extremes, improving our understanding of exposure, the human component, so things like suppression, mitigation, and really testing all of those assumptions. So maybe just to close, I don't know how much longer I've got left, Joanne, maybe a couple of minutes. I think
You're fine, Dan. 1 minute.
okay,
You're
good.
fine. You're right on time. Thanks.
I'll try and wrap up in a minute then. I think if kind of going back to my core message right at the very beginning, I think if wildfires were simply about more fire, then better hazard modeling alone would be enough. That would be the answer. But what we're seeing in real world events, what we're seeing in the losses is that it's not just a hazard modeling problem. Losses are increasing because we're seeing more extremes by where fires occur and how they're interacting with human systems. So I think where we're heading towards is not necessarily just one better model, but to really understand where models are fragile, how sensitive they are to our human decisions, and how wildfire risk is really changing. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for concise but really, really pulling it all together. Fantastic. I forgot to mention some housekeeping rules at the beginning. We have trying to keep our presentations to 15 minutes so that we have enough time for fielding questions and answers. And so anybody's welcome out there. And I see now we've got up to 29 or so participants. This is terrific. Anybody's welcome to put into the question and answer, please not into the chat, but into the question and answer any questions that you would have for Dan. And while we wait for all of your questions, I would put a question to you, Dan. You didn't kind of distinguish between the CAT modeling and the sort of the modeling for sort of parametric products where you would only need, as you said, it would be easy enough to do the hazard modeling. And if you're going to do parametric products where your trigger might be burned area, then you wouldn't need your exposure and vulnerability data. And my understanding is that a lot of insurers are moving towards parametric products in wildfire, which, in my mind might have two disadvantages. It might not capture, losses in urban areas. It might be very good for forests. And second, it's very hard to, well, maybe not, but hard to capture disaster risk reduction or capture any kind of nature-based solution. So maybe you could just speak to that.
Yeah, I might not necessarily agree, Joanne, that you
Mhm.
wouldn't necessarily need exposure data for parametric solutions because it's still very much about what is in the perimeter of the fire and how vulnerable it is to fire and how damaged or how costly will it be to repair. So I think regardless of where we're heading towards solutions, it's not just a hazard modeling problem. I think we need to have better information, better data, and better models for exposure, for damage, and for vulnerability. And then towards your point as to kind of the rise of parametrics, I think that's really just a testament that I think the insurance industry has traditionally been about transferring risk rather than trying to reduce it. But I think the rise of these alternative mechanisms like parametrics has really been helpful to push community protection in the right direction. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in the next couple of years as we get new innovative wildfire models.
Hey, I'm just looking here. No, we still don't have questions. Come on, people out there. I'm sure you have questions. Don't be shy. Every question is good. Even yeah. So Tim, yeah, we can just have a little debate on this. And by the way, speakers, if you want to ask Tim something, go ahead. Just put your hand up, and no problem. But you said okay, you don't need exposure or vulnerability data for the kind of parametric modeling. But it depends on what your trigger is, right? If your trigger is just burned area, yeah, then you wouldn't need it, right? But maybe you can think of more sophisticated triggers where you would need it, or maybe it's just how much coverage would people need? Yeah.
I suppose it might largely depend on the assets that's being protected by the parametric policy, but you still need to know what's in the way, what's the value of what's being protected by the policy. So I don't know. Maybe we're agreeing. I think.
Yeah. Okay, but we've got a good question now in the chat. It says from the NATURANCE host, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Is that Tim? Is that from you? Let me read this to you. It's kind of a long question, but let's see. So it says, if insured losses are compensated and routinely absorbed as part of insurance business models, in what sense can they meaningfully be understood as losses? Furthermore, to what extent does an insurance-focused research agenda risk serving the interests of insurance companies among the most profitable actors globally, rather than serving the interests of communities, meaning the Black, the poor, the working class in the US, that are excluded from insurance, underinsured, are disproportionately burdened by its costs and conditions? Yeah, that's a very good question. And maybe as an American, I might come into that. But first, then why don't you see if you have some insights on that question?
Yeah, there's perhaps several ways of breaking down that question. I think in terms of the second part of it around the research agenda, so I work within a global risk and insurance broking company. I work within the research network specifically, where we work with global research institutions, and we have done for the last 20 years. And we fund a variety of different sizes and shapes research projects. I think what we're always very keen is to make sure that hold on, the question's disappeared. We're always very keen to make sure that the research projects that we are funding and we are participating in don't just serve the commercial side, that they do have research and science interest within them. So hopefully that goes some way into not just serving the insurance industry, but also the academic community. And then I think also kind of around serving the interests of maybe underrepresented communities. Again, I think this is really the role that insurance industry has, particularly parametrics, in financing or incentivizing for wildfire things like good land management practices, so that we can make sure that these communities are protected for if and when something goes wrong. I don't know whether you had any other thoughts on that, Joanne?
No, thank you. Thanks very much. I will, yeah, I have thoughts, but I think it would be better because we're running out of time, but better that I turn, maybe there's now 2 questions in the question and answer. Please, yeah, put your questions into question and answer. One is by Elena Goretz-Mitsud. Thank you, Elena, for this. And she says, thank you for this great overview. Are there any efforts to develop insurance models products to capture better the mitigation efforts by landowners? Probably this is not an attractive business, as the insurance industry, as previously mentioned, does not necessarily aim at reducing risk. Any reflection would be appreciated. First, I should say, Elena, that our third speaker will talk to a model, I believe, and I hope, Tim, a model that has brought in some nature-based solutions as a mitigation effort. And so I don't know, Dan, if you want to add anything to that.
Maybe just to say something like that would be the holy grail, really, of wildfire models, of being able to probabilistically or otherwise capture human behavior and mitigation attempts into understanding how we control wildfires before they've started or after they've started. So, are there plans? I don't know, but that would definitely be of interest.
Yeah, okay. And I'll just quickly put this other question on the table, but I think it could also maybe be addressed by our other speakers. And it says, I'm not sure if this will be a question for Daniel or another panelist, but are there insights from other types of insurance against hazards like flooding that could be applied to fire, or perhaps important differences that make this insurance much different? I could take a first quick crack at that just to say that for me, it's very interesting if you look at wildfires and you look at parametric products, that it's one of the few really risks or natural disaster risks that you really can influence the hazard itself. With flooding, if you say that the hazard is actually the precipitation, then it is very difficult, of course, to influence precipitation, but you can influence kind of starting the fires and the hazard itself. So I think that's an interesting difference, also for insurers. Dan, do you want to speak further to that, or should we leave that on the table also for other speakers?
No, let's leave that one and move on.
Move on. Okay, good. So let me thank you again, Dan. Brilliant.
Thank
And I will move on now to Saskia Kistre, who please, Saskia, if you will share your
Yes,
screen.
thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. So it's really lovely to interact with all of you and get to know you a little bit. So I will share my screen. Let me see where I am. Okay, share. Then I go here and should go. Ooh, I should have prepared this. Sorry. Okay, here we are. So I was asked to tell you a little bit about some work that I have done last year and the year before on nature-based solutions in relation to what you could use nature-based solutions for in terms of wildfires. Then we have both looked at different nature-based solutions for preventing fire. So managing your landscape to reduce the risk that the fire will actually occur. And on the other hand, also what kind of techniques or nature-based solutions you could use to reduce the effects once a wildfire actually occurred in terms of flooding and sediment transport that could occur. So then there is a report that we made because this work was done in commission of from the European Environment Agency, and we first wrote a report, a quite lengthy report that was actually also on nature-based solutions, not only for fire risk but also for pest risks in European forests. And then last year we made a briefing out of that, which is a much shorter, only 8 or 10 pages in total that you could have a look at. And here you can see the link here, but you can't. I think that the slides are going to be shared, so then you could click on that, or you could just type this in Google, and then you will find it. So we are looking for nature-based solutions for fire-resilient European forests and fire-affected land. So let me see. Okay. So first of all, I was told also because lately we also did in the framework of another project some um, some workshops with people that are working on fire. And then we found that the term nature-based solutions that I personally have been working on for like I don't know, maybe 20 years, but so I thought that this was a term that everybody knew. And then we found that it's actually not a very well-known term at all. So therefore, I was asked also here to explain a bit what a nature-based solution really is. So it is a solution, a land management that you could do that is inspired by or supported by or copied from nature. You could say that it is maintaining and enhancing natural capital as a basis of the solution, and it can address a variety of societal challenges, among which also fire. It is potentially cost effective, is research and energy sufficient, and resilient to change. So this is a big difference with normal gray solutions, as they are then called. So these are structural concrete or iron or whatever built in solutions that are usually over time reduce their efficiency, while nature-based solutions are often things that are increase their resilience and their efficiency over time. So they have the potential to contribute to green growth, to future-proofing society, to fostering citizens in well-being and human health, and also provide business opportunities. So nature-based solutions are, according to, there are a lot of different definitions out there, but are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial freshwater, coastal and marine ecosystems. So that is the one that I personally prefer. So it has, anyway, so this is a diagram that I created to myself just to also showcase that there are many different types of nature-based solutions. It comes from a paper that I wrote on food systems in relationship to nature-based solutions a couple of years ago. So basically, you could say you have so-called intrinsic nature-based solutions that are using an existing ecosystem, and usually these are things that are quite large scale, such as for instance, a mangrove to protect your coastline against flooding from the sea. Or you can have all the other way. This is an inspired, so it's designed new ecosystem that you design. Typically, you could have an example such as a phytofilter that you use. You plant in a plastic box, you put some plants that are purifying your water. And then you have everything in the middle. So most things obviously will be something in the middle. And most of the things that you could use for wildfire protection would be these hybrid, modified or managed ecosystems. So you plant a row of trees that are more fire resilient than for instance, trees that burn very easily, such as coniferous forest. Then that can create a vegetative fire strip instead to not doing that and creating an extra fire hazard. So another diagram that I made a while ago in another paper that was on nature-based solutions in land management. So you have different types again that can actually help to improve ecosystem services that can then help also to reach either your sustainable development goals in the case of this particular paper, or to reach wildfire. So just to quickly go now to the wildfire, why it's important. So you all probably know this, but otherwise you wouldn't be in this webinar. So fire is a natural part of the Earth system. This is one of the key messages that we also try to get across in this briefing and the report that I just mentioned before. So, however, even though fire has occurred over over the entire since vegetation exists on Earth, it is the frequency, intensity, and impact, especially the impact of wildfires in Europe is increasing. And for as just in terms of statistics, you can see that an average between 2000 and 2024, an average of 3,770 square kilometers of land was subject to fires in the European member countries, the EEA the European Environment Agency member countries. So climate, what are the things that are increasing this impact and this intensity and frequency is climate change, just also was mentioned by the previous speaker, urban expansion and land abandonment in rural areas are really increasing the occurrence of fire-prone conditions. And the interface between wildfire and urban areas is also increasing. And at the moment is more or less estimated to be about 7.5% of the land surface in Europe. So first of all, it's really important to understand the process. So we have this diagram that is the various versions of this diagram go around already in literature for quite a long time. So we have basically three types of conditions that we need to understand each one of them, how they are changing and how they are in a specific location to identify what is the risk on fire. So you need to have different things to have a fire. You need to have enough things to burn. So you need to have the fuel. You need to know about what type of biomass you have. If it's dead, it's alive, where it is distributed along the landscape. Then you need to look at your conditions. So you need to look at the topography. You need to look at your fire season length, the connectivity of your fuel in your landscape. And then, of course, the more meteorological conditions such as humidity, wind, and temperature and rainfall. So you have typically when you look at climate, you see the Mediterranean climate is the ideal climate to have a fire or often have fires because you have a wet season in which you have a lot of fuel being grown, and you have a dry season in which your vegetation can dry sufficiently and it's hot enough to actually get a fire going and spreading really quickly. And then of course you need to have an ignition, that the fire doesn't start from nothing. Of course, we have lightning, but that is really minor when it comes to the ignition of most of the fires that occur. Most of them are the effect of human activities, either by arson or by accident. So okay, let's go to the next page. So I already did this without the slides. So the risk of a fire, which is also really important, is not necessarily, but that's also what my previous speaker knows much more about than I do. It is not only if it is actually happening, but also where it's happening, and because it is important to know what is the impact of the event. So then what to do to reduce the amount of effects of a wildfire. A second. So as I said, the nature-based solutions are a strategy to utilize natural processes and ecosystem to address environmental, social, and economic challenges while promoting human well-being and biodiversity. So the goal is, in the end, to transition from fire suppression to fire management. And this relates to what I was just saying before. If you want to reduce, if we go back to this diagram, if we want to reduce the risk of having a fire, then we need to look at all these different elements. And in all of these different elements, you can have an impact with your nature-based solutions. So you can, and especially, so there are basically two main parts that we can do. On the one hand, we can try to reduce the amount of fuel. And this is also related to this example that is going to be shown later. So options, for instance, are adaptive forestry. So using different types of species that are less flammable, to use green corridors, So to create bands of vegetation that are less flammable, because you still want to grow the flammable trees, because you can sell them better because you are trying to create wood with your forestry. You can do agroforestry. You can do rewetting of your system so that it's less flammable. You can do rewilding, in which you are transitioning from fire suppression to fire management. So the fire management really is the landscape management. Also, the other thing that I was telling, so you have the nature-based solutions for fire risk reduction, which mainly focus on this reduction of fuel. And then you also have nature-based solutions for post-fire management, which mainly are focusing on reducing the connectivity of your landscape in terms of the ability of the landscape to transport water and sediment and support vegetation growth. So options that you have, also depending on how long ago your fire actually occurred, would be things like log barriers, active seeding, mulching, or to do nothing. In many cases, you can see that sometimes the people, they feel that they really should do something because the whole mountain burned down. But in the end, going in there, this fragile ecosystem that has shaped because of the fire, it's better to not touch at all, instead to going in there with lots of big machinery and remove the logs and destroy the thin layer of ash that actually is there. So the co-benefits of nature-based solutions are also important to have a look at. So they increase the resilience of the forest to other climate change threats, such as, for instance, a pest outbreak. So if you have a more closer to nature, if you do more closer to nature forestry, so having more different types of tree species in there, you will have also the if you don't have a monoculture, you have less risk of a pest outbreak. So what is then the most suitable nature-based solution for a specific site? It's really important to look at the site-specific biophysical conditions. So if you think back again on this triangle that I showed before, so what are the things that you can do in that specific region? How steep is your slope? What kind of climate do you have? What kind of soil do you have? And what is then the best thing that you can do for that specific area? But also the socioeconomic conditions. Like, do you have, like in the north of Europe, you have a lot of forests that are used for forestry. So they're actively still growing trees to sell them later as wood. So while in many places in the south of Europe, this kind of economy is really very low, and this is not so much of an issue. But there you have other economic conditions that are important, such as your land abandonment, for instance, on which I could do another whole webinar if you would like. And then you have the governance conditions. For instance, one of the things that is done a lot in many countries, especially in the US, where they sort of invented that, is to do prescribed burning. So then you do burning, such as you can see here on this picture on the left. You see that in a wet part of the season, you burn down your undergrowth, which means that the trees are a little bit scorched, but they don't die, but the undergrowth is gone. And when it is summer, then you will never get a big fire anymore, because the main thing that also this relates to the previous speaker, the conditions are not only changing that we have more fires, but the type of fire is really changing. We're seeing much more mega fires, which are really creating a lot of risk, a lot of damage, not only to the ecosystem, but also to a threat to people. And it is actually, many people think that we need to have less fires. No, we actually need to have more fires, but we need to have more smaller fires, because we have more smaller fires, then they are manageable and they are not a threat. So the risk is lower. And also, when you do a nature-based solution in in a certain area, to go and implement it. Try to involve your stakeholders early so that they understand why this is happening and also understand that it is actually beneficial for the community where it's going to happen. So how to do that then? Just a few things. So the factors that are influencing the implementation of nature-based solutions and how could you scale them? So there are different problems. So you have competing priorities. Do you want to have more biodiversity or more timber? Do you want to have more recreation in an area or more nature protection? There's also conflict between biodiversity or carbon storage goals. Then there's also issues among when you want to implement a nature-based solution when it comes to ownerships and capacity of changing something, because much of land and much of forest in Europe is privately owned. Then there's a lot of smallholder farmers or smallholder forest owners that don't have too much money to change anything, or they are just not around and it's difficult to find them. There's also economic and market barriers. So it is sometimes difficult to finance nature-based solutions when it comes to when it's not from public money. The return period of getting your investment is long, and also the market currently still on ecosystem services is also weak. Then when it comes to governance and monitoring, there's a need for alignment and long-term strategies, and we need to also look for stronger monitoring frameworks. And then finally, the community preparedness. That is really very important when you want to implement nature-based solutions for wildfires or any nature-based solution for that matter, because people are not aware and they don't know what the benefits are. So I will skip this. And then with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and also draw your attention to Fire Congress that I am part of the organizing committee, which we'll have this year in November in the Kruger Park in South Africa. If you would like to know more about it, you can go to our website or email me. So that was it. Thank you.
Hey, all right. Okay, Saskia, thank you so much. I think this gave us a really very good overview and to see the complexity of the nature-based solutions on all aspects, from the physical aspects all the way to really the governance. So this, I think you really touched on that. And yeah, we have a question in the question and answers from Dolores Armenteris. And so I'll read that for you. It says, first, she thanks you for this presentation. And she says, when you say that rewilding helps the transition from fire suppression to fire management, could you please clarify what you mean in practical terms? For example, are you referring to measures such as reintroducing large herbivores to reduce fuel loads or restoring more diverse patchy landscapes that act as natural fire breaks? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. There's, of course, rewilding is a bit of a term that sometimes I try to avoid because it creates some kind of confusion often. In my view, rewilding is not just doing nothing. Rewilding is indeed something like, for instance, introducing certain herbivores or even the predators that changed there's this classic case from the US in one of your big nature reserves where they introduce wolves again and then they totally change the ecosystem because of it. And also actually reducing the fire risk in that region because the connectivity of the vegetation changed completely. So, but I think in general, it is there you do with rewilding, you do need to do some kind of management in helping nature to become again natural, which is different than just doing nothing. So I don't know whether that answered the question, but I hope so.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody else wanting to put a question in? Um, yeah, well, I'll just kind of, I think, go to your last slide. I really liked that, how you brought out in the last slide the trade-offs across the board, yeah. So, in the end, there's choices to be made. I think even with the rewilding, there's choices to be made because we have, in economist view, we have a very multi-objective function. And if you do one thing, you might reduce other. And I just wonder where you see the most serious trade-offs. I mean, I know that I believe, but you tell me, I think with the nature protection law in the European Union, there became some conflict about whether, I mean, I believe in there was some things on forest management, which you're an expert on, to leave the dead wood. And then the sort of the fire, managers came in and said, well, you're just setting up a tinderbox if you leave firewood in your forests. I don't know how that was resolved, but I think that's, where one conflict has come out into political debate, but maybe that's not the most important one. So do you have any insights on that?
Well, it is totally true that there is a conflict. So, and of course, you always need to and there's not really any good or bad in my view, because they're both true.
Mm.
So in my view, you need to find a balance in where you can, in some patches of your, if I would be the one that had to say what was going to happen, I would just make patches in your forest where you say, okay, this is a patch where we'll keep the dead wood. And then this is really good for your biodiversity because we have lots of fungi that can come there and also some birds that can make hollows in it and so. And then, but the part of the forest that is next to the village, we won't do that because then you create a fire break between the village and the other forest. So this, of course, would entail, or you make another. Like I know, for instance, there is a in a forest where I've worked in Valencia. They have in the urban wildfire interface, in a wildland interface, they have made a series of sprinklers that are fed with treated wastewater to keep a strip of vegetation wet in between the nature reserve and the municipality or the urban space, so to say. So to create a wetter with different species of trees to make sure that if the fire would come, then it will be stopped by this fresh vegetation that will stop the fire. Anyway, so there's a lot of different, and that's what I was saying. It's really very site specific. There is no, there's no.
I think that's an absolutely really important insight. That I mean, we're talking now often about mosaics, but I think the idea that we have, a more hybrid kind of concept of nature-based solution where we're, in the wildland urban interface, where we simply can't just let it go wild or probably even reintroduce, wolves. But, but of course, out where we don't have, a lot of settlement, yes. And which I think fundamentally brings us to our land use planning. We're going to have to keep settlements more out of areas that we really need to protect. And I think there's where where we might land with all of this. But I really appreciate that. And I'm definitely, looking forward to going back over your slides. Terrific. By the way, I should also say we're also doing a project in Valencia on nature-based solutions. I haven't heard about this sprinkler. We're dealing with drought, not flood. Of course, flood is now the big topic in Valencia, but with drought and nature-based solutions. So that's also really good to know that you're also working there. We'll have to be back in touch on that. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. We are exactly at 1 o'clock, so we're exactly on time. I thank my speakers for that. And I think now we will really move more into the insurance world and ask Tim to give his presentation. So Tim, do you want to share your slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks to the other speakers. I hope my talk can really build upon what we've heard so far. So as Joanne said, I'm Tim Foreman. I'm working both at the IIASA and at WU here in Vienna. And if I have sort of a broad takeaway from my talk, it's that all of these nature-based solutions that we've just been hearing about right now are not necessarily going to take place on their own. It will take some policy action in order to get this actually started and going, as we were just touching on at the end of the discussion there. But the good news is that there are some policy options out there and ones that are not necessarily very costly to public authorities. So hopefully there are some ways forward that we can start implementing these nature-based solutions and making them relevant in the insurance space. So today I'm going to be touching on two existing programs that could serve as models for implementing nature-based solutions in a way that reduces disaster risks and can therefore be relevant for the insurance markets. One of these is in California, looking at a fairly recent wildfire insurance regulation that has now been implemented there. I'll take you through some of the details and how I think it can be relevant for implementing nature-based solutions. And then looking also, again in the US, at the National Flood Insurance Program, their community rating system, which allows communities to reduce their risks and see a premium reduction for that. So interestingly, the US generally has a more regulated insurance market than Europe. In particular, some states have very stringent insurance requirements. And California, as we've seen, has been the epicenter of growing wildfire damage and ever increasing risks. And so they're really having to deal with this problem and tackle it head on. So this was a program that became effective in October of 2022 and was designed to reduce insurance costs for policyholders that were able to take measures to protect their properties from wildfire risk. And it applies broadly to any insurer operating in California that differentiates its rates with respect to wildfire risk, which is most of the big insurers. So one of the pieces of this regulation is that it requires insurers to recognize wildfire risk mitigation measures. So there was a question earlier about, can insurance companies take into account sort of these individual level actions that households may take to protect their property from these risks? And here California is saying, in fact, you must. If you're an insurer who's differentiating based on wildfire risk, then you have to recognize certain measures that households take that are designed to reduce the risk. So this includes both community level measures, which is mostly what I'll be talking about going forward, but it also has to do with whether you clear the brush around your house, things about your property surroundings, and building characteristics of the house itself, which are generally called building hardening measures. So the two community measures that this regulation takes into account are these fire risk reduction communities, which are implemented by the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and the FireWise USA program. So if you're in good standing with this FireWise USA, which is basically a nonprofit that comes in and tells you what you need to do in order to reduce your fire risk, if you comply with their regulations and stay in good standing, you are also entitled to a discount on your insurance. Okay, so just to give a bit more detail on what these community level measures look like. So for the fire risk reduction community, you must have adopted certain local ordinances, which designate are called very high fire hazard severity zones, which are lined up with state regulations. And these look like something from the National Flood Insurance Program, the special flood hazard areas. These are basically just areas at elevated wildfire risk exposure. So this is really targeting the highest risk areas and mapping it out community by community. They are also required to adopt fire safety elements set out by state codes and follow recommendations from the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. So basically, in setting up one of these fire risk reduction communities, you invite the state board to come in and make recommendations for your community on what you can do to reduce your fire risk. And then you must also have a zoning ordinance that has stricter standards than the minimum state guidelines, or some alternative zoning guidelines that increase defensible space around different structures. The other option is becoming a Firewise USA site. This looks quite similar. It's just instead of working with the state board, you're working with this nonprofit that has already been in existence and that the state government is now recognizing as having basically good practices in reducing wildfire risk. And so in order to do this, the community has to set up a board that will oversee wildfire preparations, work with the local wildfire expert that's sent to them by this nonprofit, complete the community wildfire risk assessment, and identify efforts to reduce wildfire risk and potential actions to further reduce it. There's an assessment that must be updated at least every 5 years. The board must then create a 3-year plan that prioritizes actions to reduce ignition risks. And each year, the community must invest at least 1 volunteer hour per home within the community boundary. So basically, on average, each household should commit 1 hour per year in order to stay in good standing and use this hour to reduce the community's wildfire risks. There's a bit of an open question as to whether these programs actually reduce wildfire risk, or it's kind of just a good way for the community to get together and organize itself. But in some preliminary work that we're doing, we're showing that actually this can reduce wildfire risk. So after a community adopts this Firewise USA site designation, then it sees a small but meaningful change in its probability of having a fire in the subsequent years. So it seems like this is actually doing something, and so it really makes sense that the state is saying if a community does this, then they should be rewarded for it in terms of lowered insurance premiums. So the other part of this is that insurers have to notify policyholders about what they can do and what types of premium reductions they're entitled to. And so here's an example of what this disclosure looks like. So this is just making sure that each and every household with an insurance policy that will be affected by these measures knows exactly what they can get based on the different actions that they can take. And this is a fairly typical range of values for what you can expect to get. So all this is saying is that for community level actions that you can take, your premium will be applied a factor of 0.98 to 1. So you can get up to a 2% reduction in your premium based on being a Firewise USA site, for example. And this is very much on the same plane, or kind of the same magnitude of a premium risk reduction in terms of when you compare it to other actions that you can take, such as clearing vegetation from under your decks, clearing out combustible material around the house, or taking building hardening actions like having a fire-rated roof, enclosing your eaves, and so on and so forth. So just to highlight a couple of the drawbacks of this type of regulation, one way that insurers have chosen to comply with the regulation is to stop differentiating premiums by the wildfire risk and just implement kind of constant policy across space, which means that a lot of people will see higher premiums than they otherwise would. And another tactic that insurance companies have had is to stop writing policies in California altogether. Although there's been some subsequent actions in the wake of this policy in order to draw a lot of insurers back into California. Another thing I should mention here is that none of these policies are explicitly designed at this point to incorporate or encourage nature-based solutions. However, it would not be difficult to change these if a government was interested in promoting more nature-based risk reduction that could easily be included in these types of policies, which are already implemented and already have monitoring in place for the actions that are being taken. Okay, so just quickly, another sort of inspiration that can be drawn on in terms of thinking about how nature-based solutions could be implemented in the insurance context is looking at the National Flood Insurance Program community rating system in the US, where communities can take risk reduction actions to gain points, which translate into premium reductions. And so here, a lot of what communities can do is things like, again, zoning regulations, where you're not allowed to build in very high risk flood areas, and preserving a lot of open space and floodplain areas where you can have floodwaters being diverted away from more urban built up areas and into more natural floodplains. So even though here nature-based solutions are not explicitly required, it is actually a way that some communities do choose to comply with these regulations. And again, this is something that could be more promoted in the design of the regulation itself. But as we talked about a bit in the last presentation, there can be some tension and goals between reducing risks as much as possible and the implementation of nature-based solutions. And this is where a lot of more kind of hybrid solutions are often proposed, where you have some gray solutions like dams, dikes, levees, these sorts of ideas in conjunction with more added floodplains, for example. And then I just want to highlight quickly one example where this has happened in a more private market setting, and this is something that I think is potentially exciting going forward in terms of adopting wildfire risk reduction practices and having it actually recognized by insurers, and also taking into account this community scale action. So there's a case in California where the Tahoe Donner Homeowners Association, so this is a private group of homeowners that are part of this association, they have actually received lower premiums based on implementing some kinds of forest treatment in the surrounding forest around the community. And here you can see, this is from the technical report of the implementation of this system. And what I want to highlight is, in particular, they did this modeling, not accounting for fuel reduction, and gave a deductible limit and a gross premium based on that scenario. And then they modeled it for the actual scenario where there is this fuel reduction that has taken place. And you can see that the deductible is lower and still the premium is reduced by about 40%. And so this is maybe the only existing case where something like this has happened, but it shows that it is possible for insurance companies to actually take this into account. But given that this is kind of a unique scenario, it's not something we can count on to make this happen in a widespread situation. And this was really made possible by a unique combination of factors. Basically, this was a new line of insurance for a homeowners association. There hasn't been an insurance in place prior to this, so this is something the insurance company was interested in. It may have been prohibitively expensive without this kind of forest treatment. And there was some outside support from the Nature Conservancy and from the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, which provided some of the technical expertise, some coordination, getting everyone kind of on the same page and really involved here. And so it's potentially a good kind of idea and seed for seeing this applied in other places, but we cannot necessarily count on these factors all lining up in the same way all the time. And again, this was a fairly unique circumstance. It doesn't apply to individual property owners. It's really for the community itself that's taking this on. So it requires some coordination. But I will stop there and look forward to hearing any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. And you might not know, but Tim is from California originally, but has now taken refuge in Vienna. So, but obviously very knowledgeable and very usefully knowledgeable what was going on in California with wildfire risks. So thanks, Tim. Yeah, we have one question and answer, but it's more of a comment congratulating on the inspiring talks and providing two looking like very interesting references that are really very recent. So thank you, Adrian, who I believe I know. And I think everybody has access to this Q&A, am I right? So you can see these references here from Adrian. Okay, we've got about 12 minutes left in this webinar, so I'll first maybe give a little bit of an emphasis to what Tim was talking about. Not really so much of a question, Tim, but I think one thing that we've kind of talked about while doing this work is that with nature-based solutions, and this is across the board with floods and so on. These are really mainly community actions. If you look at households for wildfire, I mean, you want households to clear all the vegetation around their house as much as you can. I mean, I can leave a few trees. And of course, that's not a nature-based solution. That's not encouraging snakes and insects and so. But if you, and I think Saskia really came onto this very, very well. If you can, look at your landscape and take your landscape measures, there you can move much more towards some ecological management of your landscape. And so that's a dilemma for insurers, because insurers, I mean, it's not obviously altogether true, but for the most part, they're focused in on property insurance and on households or businesses, and not so much on people who are managing landscapes. So it was really a kind of innovation that's starting to take place where insurers devise policies in the case Tim was talking about, but he didn't go into detail because of lack of time. But it was actually a housing association who was actually managing a big kind of forested area in California where there's a lot of houses. And so the insurance was for the housing association, who was responsible for a lot of restoration work after a wildfire, not for the individual houses, but for everything else. So this is the ideal. This was kind of the ideal situation to combine the idea of a nature-based solution with, in fact, an insurance premium. And I see maybe Saskia has her hand up. And do you want to add on to that, Saskia, or maybe ask a different question?
I wanted to say, like, when it can, because you said you sort of make it a very strong distinction between either you're good for biodiversity or you're good for wildfire reduction. I don't think that is necessarily true. Like in some cases, like the dead wood, yes. But for instance, in somebody's house, if you are giving advice to people that live close to a fire-prone area, you could still have vegetation in your garden. You don't need to have a concrete garden, but you should not have, for instance, like many people have, then they make a fence out of this coniferous plant that makes a hedgerow, which is super dry on the inside and green on the outside, and is like evergreen. This is like a torch.
Mm.
But you can have very well, you can have a hedgerow, but not made of that plant.
Mhm.
So you can even these other less flammable species might even be better for biodiversity than that one. It's just that this one, which many people have, is very low maintenance.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
you know, so and it looks nice and it's evergreen.
Mm.
So, but it's super flammable. So, but people usually don't realize that they do that. So, yeah, there are many really different things that can be done that are going to improve the situation and not necessarily need be bad for biodiversity.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And we need we need more advice on that, I think, because when I look at there's even some YouTube webinars or YouTube things on hardening your house in California, on what you should do to harden your house. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I did all that to my house, I wouldn't want to live there. I mean, it was like almost putting yourself into a steel frame. You know, you get rid of the wood balconies, the wood terraces, you get rid of a lot of the plants around, you don't certainly have anything wood, structures. It was, what we would think in, at least where I live, would think it's a very unorganic house and not a very healthy place to live. But I see, I think there's a line there, where you can start thinking creatively about non-flammable materials that are at the same time, organic. And
Yeah.
that's that's a great way to go. I don't know, Tim, if you want to say anything. I think you've probably also looked at these house hardening rules. They're pretty strict. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the tricky things, I mean, we're getting into a couple of the trade-offs here, right? In terms of also in terms of how complicated these regulations are to comply with, right? If you're saying, okay, you can have this list of plants, but not this list of plants, then people go, well, I'm just not going to have anything there, and I'm going to build my concrete fortress, and be done with it. And so that's kind of also something I think we need to be thinking about. And then, yeah, to your point about, yeah, this concrete fortress might not be that nice to live in. I mean, that's also a trade-off you have to think about. If you're living in a very high risk
Yeah.
fire environment, then maybe that's what we need people to do so that we're not having these huge economically and lives costly disasters.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I do also feel like I totally agree. I also wouldn't like to live in a concrete house with only concrete things around me. But on the other hand, if you are living in a forested area which is fire prone, then you also should not, and you don't want to do anything to protect yourself, then you shouldn't cry if your whole house is going to burn down. It's just like if you build your house in the middle of a floodplain and then you complain that the flood is coming, it's just your own fault. You should not have lived there. It's I don't know. It's sometimes people are I don't know. I don't understand that.
I mean,
Or
it's
you
true, but
or
it's also it's complicated with the changing climate, right? Like places that were okay to live 50 years ago, maybe are not so okay to live in
No, but
these days.
actually, this is true. In one hand, it's true. But if you look at, for instance, to go back to Valencia again, where I spent a lot of time, then in the area where they had the big flood, then if you look at 50 years ago or even 15 years ago, most of the area that was very heavily economically affected by the flood was not built up area 15 years ago, and now it is. So this is nothing to do with climate change. It has all to do with spatial planning.
Right. Dan, you're still online here, right? Do you have any comments on this discussion from an insurer's point of view?
No, I kind of the conversation was going towards the question I wanted to ask Saskia, really around whether she had any thoughts or reactions on thinking about the LA wildfires, which was very much an urban conflagration. And we spent a bit of time this afternoon thinking more about nature-based solutions in more rural settings, so what strategies or solutions are there for more urban environments? I don't know, Saskia, whether you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I have to say that I don't have a lot of experience with these urban fires, but in principle, a fire is a fire, and a fire burns when there is fuel, and the fire stops when there is a fire break. So all, in my view, what they should be done is to make sure that the fire cannot go there. So you need to make your landscape in such a mosaic way with good spatial planning that you are not living next to the forest, and that the forest fire can, or you need to do something with the adaptation of the forest where it is. And you need to, when you do, that's what I was saying also, like we need to go from fire suppression to fire management, which means basically forest management in a different way. So because we cannot avoid having fires, we just need to have different types of fires that are controllable. Because if you wait until you get a massive fire when it's a lot of wind and it is very dry and it's super hot, then you can just forget about it. You're not going to stop the fire. You should have done something in your landscape before. You could either done prescribed fire that makes this fire, basically what it does is that the fire, when you have a fire in the fire season, it is stoppable. If your fire is really hot, you cannot stop it. It's impossible. So then you cannot rely on that. You can buy a million planes that can scoop up water and everything, but it's not going to work. Still your nice woody, shady, nice area in the suburbs of LA next to a wonderful recreation area with a lot of trees, it's going to burn down.
Okay. I think that's a good plea for prevention. I completely agree. And I understand I have actually a good colleague from our work here at IIASA whose house burned down in LA. And he tells me that they're really thinking of taking out all the palm trees in LA. So prevention can also, as we were saying, can come at a cost.
Yeah, but you don't need to go all the way to the other side to make it to a concrete jungle. It's there are things in the middle.
Yeah. Where's the sweet spot? That's absolutely how we maybe should end this, finding that sweet spot that we can live with, and also that insurers can deal with and give us the right incentives to move towards that sweet spot. And I think that's where it's really, really important, because as I understand, financing this prevention is also incredibly expensive. So, we need to really, I'm at the Institute for Systems Analysis. This is a systems problem. And I really thank very much our three speakers here. It was certainly for me to learn a lot. And I see we still have quite a few participants that I unfortunately can't see. I'd love to see you all. I saw your names. Thank you so much for joining. I do definitely hope that that you also, like me, got something out of this. And I believe, if I'm right, Rudy, that these presentations will now be online, so they are accessible. And our speakers, I'm sure, are also accessible if you want to shoot them an email. I think that's it's a wonderful community of people. I know many of you in this fire community. This is great. And yeah, so let me thank you all for participating. Let me especially thank the speakers here. Let me thank also the technical assistance that we had for making this work. And with that, it's exactly 1:31. So I think we'll say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.